The stars had always promised humanity a future. They had dreamed of peaceful first contact, of sharing knowledge with alien civilizations, of building bridges across the vast emptiness of space. But the universe had other plans. The Vorthak came without warning. Their ships appeared at the edge of the solar system on a cold Tuesday morning. Massive vessels, each one the size of a small moon, their hulls black as the void between stars. Within hours, they had surrounded every human colony from Neptune to Mercury. Within days, they had begun their conquest. Commander Kael'thas Vorn stood at the bridge of his flagship, watching the human defense fleet scatter like insects before a fire. He was tall, even by Vorthak standards, 7 feet of muscle and scale, his body a weapon forged by 10,000 years of genetic perfection. His scales were the color of volcanic glass, so dark they seemed to drink in light itself. His eyes glowed like dying embers, and when he smiled, rows of serrated teeth caught the light of burning ships. He had conquered 43 species before humanity. Some had fought, some had surrendered, all had fallen. The Vorthak Empire stretched across 300 star systems, and Vorn had personally overseen the subjugation of half of them. He was not merely a commander, he was a legend, a nightmare given flesh. The human outer colonies fell in 6 weeks. Mars held out the longest. The colonists there had built their cities deep underground, tunneling into the red rock like desperate animals. They fought with everything they had: plasma rifles, orbital cannons, nuclear weapons that turned the Martian surface into glass. None of it mattered. Vorthak soldiers marched through radiation that would kill a human in seconds. Their scales turned aside bullets and plasma fire alike. Their bones were denser than steel, their muscles capable of tearing through blast doors with bare hands. When the last Martian stronghold fell, Vorn walked through the ruins himself. He stepped over human bodies without a second glance, his heavy boots crunching on broken glass and scorched metal. A child's toy lay half buried in the ash. He kicked it aside. "Interesting creatures," he said to his lieutenant, a scarred veteran named Threk. "They fight even when they know they cannot win." "Stupidity," Threk replied. "They waste their lives for nothing." Vorn considered this. Perhaps, or perhaps they simply do not know how to surrender. He found the thought amusing. We shall have to teach them. Earth's United Defense Council watched the fall of Mars from their bunker beneath the Swiss Alps. Generals and politicians, scientists and diplomats, all crowded into a room that smelled of fear and stale coffee. They had sent their best ships to defend the colonies. Those ships were now debris, scattered across millions of miles of empty space. They sent delegations first, diplomats in expensive suits, carrying gifts of gold and art and promises of peaceful cooperation. Vorn received them in his throne room aboard the flagship. He listened to their speeches with what might have been patience. He accepted their gifts with what might have been gratitude. Then he had them executed and broadcast the footage to every screen on Earth. "Your words are meaningless," he announced, his voice booming through speakers in every city on the planet. "Your gifts are insults. You have nothing we want except obedience." They sent bribes next. Entire shipments of rare minerals, advanced technology, anything the Vorthak might desire. Vorn took it all. His fleet continued its advance. By the time his ships entered Earth's orbit, humanity had nothing left to offer. No fleet, no weapons, no hope. Vorn broadcast one final message. His face filled every screen, every phone, every display on the planet. 8 billion humans watched as he spoke. "Kneel," he said simply, "or watch your children burn." Earth knelt. The surrender was signed in the ruins of New Singapore, once humanity's greatest city, now a smoking crater surrounded by Vorthak warships. World leaders stood in a line, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they pressed their signatures to documents they barely understood. Vorn watched from his throne, a massive chair carved from the bones of a species he had exterminated centuries ago. But not everyone accepted defeat. 12,000 miles away, on a frozen moon orbiting Jupiter, a woman sat alone in a research station and watched the surrender broadcast. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 53 years old. With gray hair she never bothered to style and eyes that had seen too many wonders to be impressed by tyrants. She was a xenobiologist. For 15 years she had studied alien life forms, bacteria from Titan's methane lakes, crystalline organisms from the rings of Saturn. And now, with the Vorthak occupation spreading across the solar system, she had a new subject to study. Elena had obtained her first Vorthak specimen 2 weeks after the invasion began. A soldier, killed when his transport crashed on Europa's surface. She had dragged the body back to her lab herself, working through the night to preserve the tissues before they degraded. What she found inside amazed her. The Vorthak were not natural creatures. They had been engineered, modified over millennia to become the perfect soldiers. Their scales contained carbon structures harder than diamond. Their bones were reinforced with metallic compounds that made them virtually unbreakable. Their blood carried oxygen more efficiently than any known organism, allowing them to survive in environments that would kill any other species instantly. But evolution did not create perfection. Engineering did not create gods. Every organism had weaknesses, flaws hidden beneath the surface. Elena just had to find them. She worked for months, dissecting tissue samples, running simulations, studying every scrap of Vorthak biology she could obtain. Her research station became a morgue, filled with preserved organs and frozen blood. Her colleagues fled to Earth to be with their families. Elena stayed. She had work to do. And then, 3 months into the occupation, Vorthak soldiers came for her. They broke down her door at dawn, their massive forms filling her small laboratory. They did not explain why she was being arrested. They did not need to. She was human. That was reason enough. As they dragged her toward their transport, Elena looked back at her research one last time. Her notes were scattered across the floor, trampled by armored boots. But the important data was safe, stored in a device no larger than a coin, hidden in the lining of her sleeve. She had found what she was looking for. The Vorthak had a weakness, and she was going to show it to their emperor himself. The transport ship that carried Elena was cold and dark. She sat in a metal cage barely large enough to hold her body, her wrists bound with chains that weighed more than she did. Around her, other prisoners huddled in their own cages. Some were crying. Some were praying. One old man simply stared at nothing, his mind already broken. Elena studied her captors instead. There were 4 Vorthak guards in the transport bay. Each one stood nearly 7 feet tall, their bodies covered in scales that shifted from black to dark purple as they moved. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, tracking every movement the prisoners made. They carried no weapons. They did not need them. Their bodies were weapons enough. She watched how they moved, how they breathed, how their muscles tensed and relaxed beneath their armored skin. Every detail was data. Every observation brought her closer to understanding. The transport descended through Earth's atmosphere and landed somewhere warm and humid. When the doors opened, sunlight flooded the bay, so bright that Elena had to close her eyes. She had spent 3 months in the eternal twilight of Europa. She had forgotten how much she missed the sun. The guards dragged the prisoners out one by one. Elena stumbled as her feet touched solid ground for the first time in weeks. The air smelled of salt and smoke, of death and decay. She opened her eyes and saw what remained of New Singapore. The city had been beautiful once, towers of glass and steel reaching toward the clouds, gardens that floated in the air, held aloft by technology humanity had spent centuries perfecting. Now it was ruins. Broken buildings stood like shattered teeth against the skyline. Craters marked the places where bombs had fallen. The streets were empty except for Vorthak patrols and the occasional human slave, shuffling along with dead eyes. At the center of the destruction stood the palace. Vorn had built it from the wreckage of human civilization. The walls were made from crushed cars and collapsed buildings, fused together by heat until they formed a smooth black surface. The gates were carved from the hull of a human battleship, still bearing the scars of plasma fire. Towers rose from the structure like twisted fingers, reaching toward a sky that no longer belonged to humanity. Alina was dragged through those gates and into a world of nightmare. The interior of the palace was worse than the exterior. Vorn had decorated his new home with trophies from his conquests. Skulls lined the walls, thousands of them, representing every species he had subjugated over the centuries. Some were small, barely larger than a human fist. Others were massive, with eye sockets large enough to climb through. Human skulls had been added recently, arranged in patterns that might have been art or might have been mockery. The throne room was the largest space Alina had ever seen. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, so high that clouds might have formed there. The floor was polished stone, black as the void, reflecting the light of torches that burned with strange purple fire. Thousands of Vorthak soldiers lined the walls, their scales gleaming, their eyes fixed on the prisoners being marched toward their emperor. And at the far end of the room, sitting on a throne of bones, was Kael'thas Vorn. He was larger than Alina had expected. The videos had not captured his true scale, the way his presence seemed to fill the entire room. He sat with the casual arrogance of a predator who had never known fear, one massive leg crossed over the other, his clawed fingers drumming against the armrest of his throne. His eyes found Alina immediately, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical force pressing against her chest. She did not look away. The audience had already begun when she arrived. A group of humans knelt before the throne, their foreheads pressed to the floor, their voices shaking as they begged for mercy. They were farmers from what had been California, asking for permission to keep more of their harvest. Their children were starving, they explained. Winter was coming. They needed grain to survive. Vorn listened to their pleas with what might have been interest or might have been boredom. When they finished speaking, he was silent for a long moment. The farmers trembled on the floor, afraid to look up. "You may keep an additional 10% of your harvest," he said finally. His voice was deep, resonant, filling the throne room without effort. "In exchange, you will send your strongest children to serve in my palace. 10 of them. They will learn to be useful." The farmers began to cry, some in relief, some in grief. It did not matter to Vorn. He had already turned his attention to the next petitioners, a group of scientists asking permission to continue their research. He denied their request and had them taken away to the labor camps. Alina watched it all from her place in line. The audiences continued for hours. Humans came before the throne, begging for scraps of mercy from a creature who saw them as nothing more than insects. Sometimes Vorn granted their requests. Sometimes he denied them. Sometimes he had them killed for his amusement. There was no pattern, no logic. He was showing them that their lives depended entirely on his whim. Finally, her turn came. 2 guards grabbed her arms and dragged her forward, forcing her to her knees before the throne. She heard her crimes read aloud by a Vorthak official: unauthorized research, possession of restricted biological materials, desecration of Vorthak remains. Each charge carried a death sentence. Vorn descended from his throne. He moved with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Each step made the floor tremble. Each breath stirred the air like a small wind. He circled Alina slowly, studying her from every angle, the way a collector might examine a new specimen. "You are the scientist," he said. It was not a question. Alina raised her head. "Yes." The crowd murmured. Prisoners did not speak to the emperor. They groveled, they wept, they begged. They did not answer him like an equal. Vorn's lipless mouth curled into something that might have been a smile. "I am told you dissected my soldiers, took them apart like broken machines, studied their organs and their blood." He leaned closer, his ember eyes burning into hers. Tell me, little scientist, what did you learn? Alina felt the device in her sleeve, small and warm against her skin. She thought about the months of research, the endless nights of work, the discovery that had cost her everything. She met his gaze without flinching. I learned, she said quietly, that you are not as invincible as you pretend. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Vorn began to laugh, and the entire throne room laughed with him. The sound echoed off the walls, bouncing back and forth until it seemed like the whole world was laughing at her. Alina did not smile, she did not flinch, she simply waited. She knew what was coming next. The laughter faded slowly, like waves retreating from a shore. Vorn raised one massive hand, and silence fell instantly. Every Vorthak in the throne room went still, their attention fixed on their emperor with the intensity of predators watching for a signal to strike. Vorn looked down at Alina with new interest. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had heard many things from the species he subjugated. Pleas for mercy, promises of loyalty, desperate threats that both of them knew were empty. But this small, graying human had said something different. She had claimed to have found a weakness. It was absurd, of course. The Vorthak had been engineered for perfection over 10,000 years. Their bodies had been refined through countless generations of selective breeding and genetic modification. They had fought wars against species with technology so advanced it seemed like magic, and they had won every single one. The idea that a human scientist, working alone on a frozen moon, could have discovered something that had escaped the notice of the greatest minds in the galaxy was laughable. And yet Vorn found himself curious. "You think you could hurt me?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone of genuine amusement. He spread his arms wide, inviting her to look at him, at the mountain of muscle and scale that had brought empires to their knees. "I have killed worlds, little creature. My bones are denser than your steel. My scales have turned aside plasma fire. My ancestors fought gods and won." Alina remained kneeling on the cold stone floor, her hands still bound by chains that weighed nearly as much as she did. She looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only calculation. "I know," she said. "I have read your autopsy reports." The murmur that passed through the crowd was different this time. Not amusement, something closer to unease. The guards exchanged glances, their clawed hands tightening on weapons they did not need. Even Threk, standing in his usual position beside the throne, shifted his weight uncomfortably. Vorn noticed none of this. His attention was fixed entirely on the human woman before him. She was so small, so fragile. He could crush her skull with one hand. He could tear her limbs from her body without effort. And yet she knelt there, looking at him like she was the predator and he was the prey. It had been a very long time since anyone had looked at Vorn that way. "Autopsy reports," he repeated slowly. "You studied my dead soldiers." "I did." "And you found something, a weakness." "I did." Vorn leaned down until his face was inches from hers. His breath washed over her, hot and sulphurous, smelling of blood and burnt metal. His eyes glowed brighter, the ember light casting strange shadows across his scaled face. "Prove it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the throne room, thousands of Vorthak warriors watched in silence. They had seen their emperor face enemies with armies and weapons and powers beyond imagination. They had never seen him challenged by a single unarmed human. Alina did not hesitate. "Remove my chains." Vorn's lipless mouth split into a grin. "You want to fight me, here, now. I want to prove my claim." He laughed again, but this time there was something different in the sound. Something sharper, more dangerous. He straightened to his full height and turned to address his soldiers, playing to the crowd like an actor on a stage. "You hear that? This little creature wants to fight me." He spread his arms wide again, turning in a slow circle. "She claims she can hurt me. She claims she has found a weakness in the perfect Vorthak form." The soldiers roared their approval. They stamped their feet and beat their chests, filling the throne room with a thunder of scales and muscle. They loved their emperor. They loved his cruelty, his power, his absolute confidence. They could not wait to see him crush this pathetic human who dared to challenge him. Vorn turned back to Alina, his grin wider than ever. He gestured to the guards, and they rushed forward to remove her chains. The heavy metal fell to the floor with a crash that echoed through the sudden silence. Alina stood slowly, rubbing her wrists where the chains had bitten into her skin. She was a small woman, barely 5.5 feet tall. Her hair was gray and tangled, her clothes dirty from months of imprisonment. Standing before the massive form of Kael'thas Vorn, she looked like a child facing a mountain. "Here are my terms," Vorn said, his voice booming through the throne room. "You will hit me with everything you have. Your fists, your feet, your teeth if you wish. I will not dodge. I will not block. I will simply stand here and let you try." He paused, letting the words sink in. Around the room, Vorthak's soldiers were already laughing, already placing bets on how many bones the human would break against their emperor's scales. "If you manage to make me fall," Vorn continued, "your people go free. The occupation ends. We leave this system and never return." The laughter died. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. This was not a bet. This was an oath spoken before thousands of witnesses. Among the Vorthak, such oaths were sacred, unbreakable. If Vorn fell, he would have to honor his word. But of course Vorn would not fall. He could not fall. The idea was ridiculous. "And if I fail?" Alina asked. Vorn's grin returned, sharper than before. "If you fail, you die, slowly, publicly, and your people will watch so they understand what happens to those who dare to challenge me." Alina nodded slowly. She had expected nothing less. "I accept." The throne room erupted in chaos. Soldiers shouted and cheered, their excitement building like a storm. This would be a spectacle unlike anything they had ever witnessed. A human, weak and fragile and small, trying to hurt their invincible emperor. It would be the greatest entertainment in years. Vorn stood in the center of the room, his arms spread wide, his scales gleaming in the purple torchlight. He looked like a statue carved from living obsidian, a monument to power and conquest and absolute dominion. His grin never wavered as Alina approached him, her small form casting a shadow that barely reached his knees. "Whenever you are ready," he said, "hit me. Hit me with everything you have." Alina stopped 3 feet away from him. She rolled her shoulders, loosening muscles that had been cramped in chains for weeks. She cracked her neck, first one side, then the other. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then she reached into her sleeve. The device she pulled out was small, no larger than a coin made of dark metal that seemed to absorb the light around it. The Vorthak guards did not react. Why would they? It was clearly not a weapon. It had no blade, no trigger, no obvious threat. Just a small piece of metal in the hand of a small piece of prey. Vorn glanced at it with mild curiosity. "What is that?" Alina looked up at him, and for the first time since she had entered the throne room, she smiled. "Your weakness," she said. And then she moved. 15 years of research had led to this moment. Alina had begun studying alien biology long before the Vorthak arrived. It had been her passion, her obsession, the thing that got her out of bed every morning on that frozen moon orbiting Jupiter. She had cataloged organisms that breathed methane, creatures that lived in the crushing depths of gas giants, beings that existed at temperatures that would vaporize steel. She understood biology the way a musician understood music. It was not just knowledge, it was instinct. When the Vorthak came, she had recognized them immediately for what they were. Not natural creatures evolved over millions of years, but engineered weapons designed for a single purpose: conquest. Every aspect of their biology served that goal. Their dense bones, their armored scales, their efficient cardiovascular systems. They were living war machines, perfected over 10,000 years of careful modification. But no engineered system was perfect. There were always trade-offs, always compromises, always weaknesses hidden beneath the surface. The more complex a system became, the more potential points of failure it contained. This was true for machines, it was true for software, and it was true for biology. Alina had found the weakness in her third week of research. It was called the zethral nerve cluster. In the ancient Vorthak, before the genetic modifications and the selective breeding and the millennia of biological engineering, the zethral had served an important function. It regulated hibernation cycles, allowing the early Vorthak to survive long periods of dormancy during the harsh winters of their homeworld. The cluster sat at the base of the skull, where the spine met the brain, protected by a thin layer of scales that had to be flexible to allow head movement. Modern Vorthak no longer hibernated. The cluster had become vestigial, a leftover from their evolutionary past. It did nothing. It served no purpose. Over the centuries, Vorthak scientists had simply forgotten it existed. But Alina had found it. And she had discovered something remarkable. The zethral nerve cluster was composed of neurons unlike anything else in Vorthak physiology. They were extraordinarily sensitive to electrical impulses, designed to respond to the subtle bioelectrical signals that triggered hibernation. In a sleeping Vorthak, these neurons would receive a signal and begin the slow process of waking the body from its dormant state. In an awake Vorthak, bombarded with a massive electrical charge, they would do something very different. Alina had spent months building her device. She had scavenged parts from broken equipment, stolen components from abandoned research stations, improvised where she could not find what she needed. The result was ugly, barely functional, held together with solder and prayers, but it contained enough power to do what needed to be done. 20,000 volts compressed into a space smaller than a fingernail, enough electricity to power a small city for a fraction of a second, all of it focused into a single directed burst. She moved faster than anyone expected. 3 months in chains had weakened her body, but not her mind. She had planned this moment 1,000 times, rehearsing it in the darkness of her cell, imagining every step until it was burned into her muscle memory. Her hand shot out, crossing the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. Vorn did not flinch. He had promised not to dodge, not to block, and even if he had wanted to move, there would not have been time. Alina was small and slow by Vorthak standards, but she was also close. Very close, close enough to touch. Her palm pressed against the soft scales beneath his jaw. The zethral cluster sat exactly where her research had predicted, 2 inches below the base of his skull, protected by scales that were thinner and more flexible than anywhere else on his body. She could feel his pulse beneath her fingers, strong and steady, the heartbeat of a creature who had never known fear. She discharged the device. The sound was like thunder and silence at the same time, a crack of energy that shattered the air, followed by a complete absence of noise as every living thing in the room stopped breathing. Light flashed, so bright that it left afterimages burned into the vision of everyone watching. The smell of ozone filled the throne room, sharp and electric, mixing with something else, something like burning meat. For a single eternal moment, nothing happened. Vorn stood exactly where he had been standing, his arms still spread wide, his grin still fixed on his face. Alina's palm was pressed against his throat, smoke rising from between her fingers. The device in her hand had melted, fused to her skin by the heat of its own discharge. Pain exploded through her hand, her arm, her entire body. She ignored it. She watched Vorn's eyes. The ember light in them flickered, once, twice. Then it began to dim, fatting like coals dying in a fireplace. His grin froze, the muscles of his face locking in place. His arms, still spread wide, began to tremble. The zethral cluster had received the electrical signal, and it had responded. But instead of waking a sleeping body, It had sent that massive charge cascading through an awake nervous system. Every neuron in Vorn's body fired at once, overwhelmed by a signal millions of times stronger than anything they were designed to handle. His muscles contracted, all of them, simultaneously, fighting against each other in a chaos of conflicting commands. Then the neurons burned out. One by one, like lights going dark in a city during a blackout, the pathways that connected Vorn's brain to his body shut down. The signals that told his muscles to move, his lungs to breathe, his heart to beat, all of them scrambled and scattered and disappeared. Vorn made a sound. It was not a scream. Screaming required working vocal cords. Functioning lungs, a brain that could form the intention to cry out. This was something else, something deeper, a frequency that humans could barely hear but that every Vorthak in the room felt in their bones, a sound of complete and total system failure. His legs gave out first. The massive limbs that had carried him across 100 battlefields, that had crushed enemies beneath their weight, that had never once failed him in 3 centuries of conquest, simply stopped working. He dropped like a puppet with cut strings, his knees hitting the stone floor with a crack that echoed through the sudden silence. Then his body followed. He fell forward, his face hitting the ground, his arms splayed out beside him like broken wings. The impact cracked the polished stone beneath him, sending spiderweb fractures spreading across the floor. Dust rose from the point of impact, mixing with the smoke still rising from Alina's ruined hand. And then there was silence. Complete, absolute, terrifying silence. Alina stood over the fallen emperor, her burned hand throbbing with pain that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. She looked down at him, at the mountain of muscle and scale that had conquered 43 species, that had brought humanity to its knees, that had promised to burn their children if they did not obey. He was still breathing, barely. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, the ember light almost completely gone. He was still conscious. He just could not move. The Zethral cluster had not just conducted the electricity. It had amplified it, spreading the charge through his entire nervous system like poison through blood. The damage was catastrophic, irreversible. Every pathway that connected his brain to his body had been destroyed. Kael'thas Vorn, conqueror of worlds, terror of the galaxy, would never move again. Alina knelt beside him, ignoring the pain in her hand, ignoring the thousands of Vorthak soldiers who stood frozen around the throne room. She leaned close to his ear, close enough that only he could hear what she said. "Your bones are dense," she whispered. "Your scales are strong. Your body is the most perfect weapon the galaxy has ever seen." She paused, letting the words sink in. "But you forgot something, Kael'thas Vorn. You forgot that humans do not fight fair. We do not have to be stronger. We do not have to be faster. We do not have to be better." She straightened, looking down at him with eyes that held no mercy. "We just have to be smarter." The throne room remained frozen for what felt like hours. Thousands of Vorthak soldiers stood in perfect stillness, their minds struggling to process what their eyes had just witnessed. Their emperor, the greatest warrior their species had ever produced, lay face down on the cracked stone floor. He was not dead. They could see his chest moving, hear the ragged sound of his breathing, but he was not getting up. He was not getting up. Alina rose slowly to her feet. Her burned hand hung at her side, the flesh blackened and blistered where the device had melted into her skin. The pain was distant now, pushed aside by adrenaline and shock and something else, something that felt like victory. She turned to face the crowd. The Vorthak soldiers looked back at her with expressions she had never seen on their scaled faces before. Confusion, disbelief, and somewhere, deep in those ember eyes, something that might have been fear. "Your emperor made an oath," Alina said. Her voice was hoarse from months of disuse, but it carried through the silent throne room like a bell. He swore before all of you that if I made him fall, my people would go free. The occupation would end. You would leave this system and never return. No one moved. No one spoke. Elena pointed at the body on the floor. He fell. Threk, the scarred lieutenant who had served Vorn for over a century, stepped forward. His hand rested on the weapon at his hip, his ember eyes burning with rage and grief. He was the highest-ranking officer in the room. With Vorn incapacitated, command fell to him. He could kill Elena right now. One swing of his blade would separate her head from her body. He could order his soldiers to burn every human city to ash, to hunt down every last member of her species, to make them pay for this humiliation in blood and fire. He had the power. He had the authority. But he also had the memory of his emperor's words, spoken before thousands of witnesses. Among the Vorthak, oaths were sacred. They were the foundation of their entire civilization, the bonds that held their empire together. To break an oath, even the oath of a fallen leader, was the greatest dishonor imaginable. Threk stood there for a long moment, his hand on his weapon, his eyes locked with Elena's. She did not flinch. She did not beg. She simply waited, knowing that her life depended on his next decision. Finally, he spoke. The Emperor's oath will be honored. The words fell like stones into still water. Around the throne room, soldiers shifted uneasily. Some looked relieved. Others looked furious, but none of them challenged their new commander. None of them drew their weapons. You have 3 days, Threk continued, his voice cold and hard. In 3 days, every Vorthak ship will leave this system. We will not return. Your people will be free. He paused, and when he spoke again, there was something almost like respect in his voice. Almost. But know this, human. The galaxy is vast and the Vorthak Empire is patient. One day, when your species ventures beyond these stars, we will be waiting, and next time we will not underestimate you. Elena nodded slowly. I would expect nothing less. Threk turned away from her and began issuing orders. Soldiers rushed to attend to Vorn, lifting his massive body with careful hands and carrying him toward the medical wing. Others began the long process of organizing a withdrawal, sending messages to ships in orbit, coordinating the evacuation of ground forces. The throne room transformed from a hall of judgment into a command center, filled with the controlled chaos of a military in motion. No one paid attention to Elena anymore. She walked out of the palace alone, her burned hand cradled against her chest, her feet carrying her through the ruined streets of New Singapore. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. News of what had happened spread faster than anyone expected. By the time Elena reached the edge of the city, crowds had begun to gather. Humans who had hidden in basements and bunkers, who had survived months of occupation by keeping their heads down and their mouths shut, emerged into the fading light. They looked at her with wide eyes, their faces a mixture of hope and disbelief. Is it true? A young woman asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Are they really leaving? Elena nodded. They are. The crowd erupted. People cheered and wept and embraced each other. They danced in the streets, their joy spilling out after months of fear and despair. Children who had never known anything but occupation looked up at the sky and smiled, not understanding why everyone was so happy, but feeling the emotion nonetheless. Elena did not join the celebration. She found a quiet spot on a pile of rubble and sat down, cradling her ruined hand, watching the Vorthak ships begin their ascent into the darkening sky. One by one, the massive vessels rose from the earth, their engines leaving trails of light against the stars. 3 days later, the last Vorthak ship left the solar system. The occupation was over. The galaxy learned what had happened on Earth. Word spread from system to system, carried by traders and travelers and refugees who had fled the Vorthak advance. The story of the human scientist who had brought down an emperor with nothing but knowledge and a homemade device became a legend, told and retold until it barely resembled the truth. Some species were inspired. They began to study their own conquerors, looking for weaknesses, searching for ways to fight back. Rebellions broke out on a dozen worlds. Some succeeded, most failed, but all of them remembered the lesson that Elena Vasquez had taught the galaxy. No empire was invincible. No tyrant was untouchable. No matter how powerful they seemed, there was always a weakness waiting to be found. And sometimes, the most dangerous enemy was not the one with the biggest army or the strongest weapons. Sometimes it was the one who was willing to look and study and wait. Vorn survived. Medical records obtained years later confirmed that he was kept alive in a facility on the Vorthak homeworld, his body maintained by machines, his mind trapped in a prison of paralyzed flesh. He could think. He could feel. He could remember everything he had lost. He just could not move. Some said it was mercy. Others said it was cruelty, keeping him alive to serve as a warning to future Vorthak leaders. Elena did not care either way. She had done what she set out to do. The rest was not her concern. She spent the rest of her life studying biology, just as she had before the invasion. She taught at universities, trained new generations of scientists, published papers that transformed the field of xenobiology. She never spoke publicly about what had happened in the throne room. When people asked her about it, she would simply shrug and change the subject. But sometimes, late at night, she would look up at the stars and remember. She would remember the sound of Vorn's body hitting the floor. She would remember the silence that followed. She would remember the look in his eyes as he realized, for the first time in his long and terrible life, that he was not invincible after all. And sometimes, very rarely, she would smile. Humanity had been underestimated. They had been dismissed as weak, as fragile, as unworthy of consideration. The Vorthak had seen their small bodies and short lives and assumed that they posed no threat. They had been wrong. And across the galaxy, other tyrants were beginning to realize the same thing. They looked at their star charts, at the small yellow sun in the unfashionable western spiral arm, and they wondered. They asked themselves what else those strange creatures might be capable of, what other weaknesses they might find, what other miracles they might achieve. The universe was vast and full of dangers, but humanity had proven something important on that day in the throne room of New Singapore. They had proven that they were dangerous too. And they were just getting started.